Ian, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about how you got into art before you started working for DC Thompson. So, how you got into art at school?
Yes, well, it obviously started from infancy because I was never happier than when I had a paper and pencil. That was the way Mum and Dad kept me quiet, and it just more or less developed from there. I had to draw just about everything, anything and everything. It really obviously didn't come to anything in primary school, but as we went through secondary, of course, you were at the stage then that you were choosing courses that you would follow, and of course, naturally, art came into the course that I followed to my hires at Morgan Academy, Dundee, and that was it, more or less. From there on, the art master obviously saw something in me, a bit more talent than maybe some of the others. I don't know, to be quite honest, but they're the best judge of that sort of thing at school. And that was it.
So let's talk a little bit more about when you started at DC Thompson.
DC Thompson, it was a case of I was the trainee illustrator, and really they were obviously looking for a tea boy because that was my main job, keeping the rest of the artists, and I really do mean artists, well and truly supplied with tea in the morning and tea in the afternoon. In between times, what I did was I would spend time copying their work. There was a large chest of drawers at one end of the studio, and in that chest of drawers were goodness knows how many story headings, which had been processed, of course, and they were back there, and eventually they would be disposed of, unfortunately, in so many ways. Destruction, destroyed. A wealth of art which sadly will never be seen by anyone. However, that was what I did, and I obviously saw one or two pieces by certain artists that I was very happy to copy. I loved their work, and one of them in particular was a chap called George Ramsbottom. George, his pen work is quite magnificent. They were all good in their own way, different styles, because we're now talking in terms of 30 or more extremely talented artists weaving away on all the publications that Thompson was putting out. And but anyway, George was the one that I latched on. I liked his style, and of course he would notice as he passed that it was his stuff I was copying. So in a way, without much in the way of planning, he became my mentor.
So what we have is some story headers on the artboard at the moment. So again, what was the process behind that, and what were these used for?
They were obviously done for the traditional DC Thompson boys papers like Hotspur, Wizard, Adventure, and I worked for all of them at one stage. Subject matter, as you can see, it was pretty varied. You had to be, I think, basically, Doug Phillips, a friend of mine who unfortunately has passed away, Doug once came away with the quote that, and I think it's absolutely right, an illustrator especially is only as good as his reference system. If he's got a good reference system, he's got something that he can work from. So it was a case of magazines, newspapers, anything that would come along with perhaps a good photograph of a particular subject, it was immediately cut out and stuck in the reference book. So we built up a reference book, which was invaluable when you came to work on such a variety of subjects. Here we have, I suppose, the sort of how can I put it? The thoughts about future aircraft, which of course eventually matured in Dundee, etc. Much later on. But this particular one, the machine is purely and simply an invention of the Kennedy intellect, shall we say. And this one here, of course, up here, in a way, is a bit of a trailer for Dundee when you think on it.
So you can see from your examples that you specialised in a lot of aeronautical work. Would you find that happen quite a lot within DC Thomson when you were in-house?
Yes, of course, obviously I had always been extremely interested in aeroplanes anyway, because I wanted to fly as a career, but it wasn't to be. So the next best thing was to draw and paint aeroplanes. And one artist in particular in Thompson's specialised in mechanical stuff, airplanes, cars, you name it. So of course, if I needed any help there, I could always go along to Ian, and he would give me a few tips now and again. Sport, Freddie Sturrock, he was the sport man, football, cricket, etc. Once again, if I needed any assistance, he was the man to go to. Some of the artists were more or less the stuff they put out. There was nothing particular in the way of subjects, but others did specialise in subjects like, for instance, George Ramsbottom. If they wanted a real monster, a real dinosaur, they would go to George, because he could really, some of the creatures he devised or invented were quite wonderful to look at.
So let's talk about moving from being an in-house artist to being a freelancer.
To being freelance, yes. At the end of the day, there's one thing governs everything as far as we're all concerned, and that's how much can we earn. We've got to pay our way. And of course, DC Thomson's a lovely firm to work with, but not the biggest payer in the world. But however, Doug, who I've already mentioned, we sat side by side in the studio, and we would joke between each other about going down to London, to the gold pavements of London, and work for, as it was in those days, Amalgamated Press. But it was all useful banter as much as anything. But it did come to a head when my son was born in 1954, and at that time I was earning in old money £7.10 a week, which was all right for a couple, but when you're talking about a third party on the scene, one had to start thinking about a bit extra. I did get a bit extra from Thompson's from time to time, because we did get a wee bit of overtime, which was done at home, and that always helped swell the coffers a bit. As I say, I started with Knockout, and subjects like Davy Crockett or Hopalong Cassidy, that sort of thing. Not my favourite subject, but, well, nevertheless, that had to be done. After all, when you're a professional, you're supposed to be able to turn your hand to most things with a certain amount of success, shall we say. But then we went through the 60s, working on, as I say, starting with Knockout, etc. And eventually I was asked to work on Aries, did covers for them and inside artwork. and some of it actually is being reprinted now, much to the delight of a lot of the fans, because it's something that seems to have been lost in the background somewhere or other. But I think, as far as I know, it's Rebellion have purchased most of that stuff, so a lot of it is being reprinted. We worked on that fairly continuously, I should say, until around 1970, when Charlie Checkley, the editor of Commando, he had seen obviously some of the covers I'd done for Aries, and he decided that he would like to have me do some Commando covers. So we did our first one around about, I think it must have been 1970, and about that at the same time, quite a coincidence, but a very fortunate one, I became aware of acrylic colours. They were just coming on the market about that time, and I found that they did cause a lot of trouble at times, but if you persevered, you got some wonderful results. And over the years, I've used them now more or less continually. Well, here we actually see my very first cover for Commando, and the use of acrylics, and I'm using them in a much more thick oil impasto manner. I think that's the correct term, which was very, very effective, but rather slow and time consuming. But I didn't really notice at that time. But as time went on, I suddenly realised that it was a rather time-consuming business. So I started, as I say, to use them more in a watercolour technique. And I find that I can get some wonderful effects. The rest of the ones that you are now seeing have all been more or less done with that technique. Every now and again I will throw in a thicker application. Sometimes it's, if nothing else, to cover up a mistake, because we don't always get it right the first time. But I find acrylics are just quite wonderful in that you can paint over and over again, and they still maintain their wonderful brightness and sharpness. Here again, you see I'm using the watercolour technique, but initially it was a black and white drawing, a black and white sketch of these figures with the black ink castle in the background. These were drawn in ink and then painted in. As I say, I keep going back to the kiddies' colouring book. But one of the beauties of the acrylic colours is that what I do is I start off with a very faint wash, as close as I want to the finished strengths. But if I don't get the strengths or the actual temperature of the colour, I could then go over it again and again, if necessary, without losing the clarity and the freshness. Whereas if you try that with watercolours, all that happens is they just get muddier and muddier. Acrylics, you don't have that problem. Yes, this one is definitely a perfect example of my black and white sketch and then colouring up. As you can see in the background here in the explosion, you can actually see my pen and ink work, which I've left deliberately because I wanted to give the slightly dated feel of an old sepia print, an old etching. As for the colour itself, using the colour, I probably started off over the whole area with it not much stronger than that. Then what I did was I just gradually introduced a little, once that had dried with the aid of the hairdryer, I put in a little more just to darken it, get a nice grading there, and then and coming to the foreground, or the midground I should say, darker, and then a little more here, and darker still. We're now talking about possibly 2 or 3 applications of the colour in order to get the depth I want. And then right to the very bottom, there could well have been 3 or 4 applications of this colour to get that.
So we'll jump forward in time a little bit to the late 70s and talk a little bit about your work for 2000 AD and Starlord.
Yes, it's all, to be quite honest, Phillip, a wee bit of a haze, because I was doing work for so many publications at the time. It was only when I was looking through the meagre supply of originals I still have that I realised that I was working with Starlord in 2000 AD back in the 70s. Quite surprised to see what I did. I didn't do an awful lot because, well, to be quite honest, I was just kind of busy with all the various, and of course Thompson, they welcomed me back into the fold, so to speak, and they were supplying me with work as well as Commando covers. But at that time, Commando covers, I was possibly doing 2 or 3 a month, which was a fair amount to be going on with.
So it's safe to say that the content and style of 2000 AD was a bit more cutting edge and a bit more maybe violent compared to some of the other work that you'd done in the past. How did you find changing from, the more traditional war stories into the more futuristic realms of storytelling?
Yes, it was quite a culture shock. I know it's a rather hackneyed term, but it's about the only way one can describe it. The Judge Dredd character devised by Pat and John, and of course Carlos. He was quite a shock to my system. In that I did 1 or 2, but at the end of the day, I pretty well said no. It's not quite my world. So I just sort of slid out gently. Apart from anything else, I was possibly in any case a bit too busy to take on any more at that time. But the judge was, as I say, just a wee bit more than Kennedy could take, being used to things like Punty and Judy, etc. in the past. But strangely enough, as time has gone on, maybe I've changed, or maybe the judge has changed slightly, but as before, the twain were never going to meet. The twain now have actually met, and the judge is one of my favourite characters, and I quite enjoy portraying him in as many ways as I can. And of course there's also the other character which I rather enjoy doing, and that's the Rogue Trooper.
So around about 1982, you were asked to actually work on Dundee, or the new version of Dundee for the new Eagle. So how did that come about?
Well, it was a case of I'd had a car accident in the winter of 81, 82, if I recall, and I was out of action for quite some time. I suppose in a way, when we look back on it now, we're kind of lucky to have survived it. But there we are, we managed, and recuperated. Or during the recuperation, Barry Tomlinson got in touch with me and asked me if I would be in the market in order to take on Dundee. Of course, I jumped at the chance. Initially, it was just a centre spread, I really did enjoy it because it allowed me to let my imagination really run free with the spacecraft, etc., which in a way um, came more or less naturally to me because of my interest in aviation, and quite a few of the modern fighters that were gracing the skies at that time were really, they could well have come out straight out of a Dundee page. And it was just a case of my knowledge of these aircraft and my interest in them. It worked, it married very nicely into doing Dundee. And as I say, I was in my element, to be quite honest. And it took off from there. We did the spreads, and then they decided that it should go on the front cover of the Eagle as well, the new Eagle as it was, which I did manage because at that time I was still doing Commando covers and various annual covers, etc. But we could just manage full colour cover and full colour spread. But then they decided it would go on the back cover as well. As you can see, the ship here is actually a black and white drawing with inks. And then what I do is I colour it. In this case, in this picture here, this whole frame was coloured in yellow, a very pale yellow overall. And then I deepened the yellow in places, and I started adding greens and allowing them to flow more or less naturally in order to get the effect. And in a way, when one gets into doing it this way, you've got to be very aware of how, for instance, the colour is going to flow. So it's a case of putting the colour in this area, for instance, and allowing it. Leave it alone, let it do its own thing. It just flows into that shape, and leave it that way because that's the effect you want. That was not done with a brush. It was just a case of a spot of a colour, water acrylics used like watercolour, just a spot, and allow it to flow, thereby getting the effects you want.
So coming up to date, Ian, you're still working away. We've got a new Commando cover in progress on the drawing board. How does that work these days? It's a very quiet sort of situation now compared with way back in the 70s where we might have been doing 3 a month. Nowadays maybe it's we'll do one every 4 or 5 weeks, which is fine. I'm still involved, and that's the main thing, because I still get a tremendous, very fortunate, I get a tremendous feeling out of achieving work, a sense of achievement, and I hope that the quality is still there. I try my very best anyway. This is the current Commando cover I'm working on. I got the idea the other day, and what we do is we do a rough, as you can see in my sketch pad, a rough usually done between 2 and 3 in the morning because I'm not a good sleeper, and in many cases my best ideas come around that time. So I keep a sketch pad and a pencil by the bedside, and quite often this one was done during the night. It's apparently coming up to the anniversary of the Coventry Blitz, and we're showing something on Commando to commemorate that anniversary. So we have the rough here, and we're now coming over to my pencil sketch, a finished pencil sketch, the actual size of the Commando cover. This will again be done more or less as a black and white
full black and white sketch, inked, properly inked, which is much more easy nowadays because I can't remember when I last used a dip pen and drawing ink, because we have nowadays such a huge number of wonderful pens, fine line pens of all gauges, so I use them without any problem there at all. Then once its sketch is done, we ink it in, and then of course it's coloured in the same way.
So over the last few years, you've been a regular at many conventions across the UK. How did that come about, and what is it you actually get out of going to conventions?
Well, Phil, you know as much as anyone does how it came about. It was your good self and Chris Murray who twisted my arm fairly violently at the end of the day to get me to attend a convention at which I actually met Cam Kennedy for the first time. Cam, we're not related, but we've built up a rather nice friendship since then. But I suppose working at home on my own all these years, plus the fact that even as a laddie I was a wee bit of a loner. My favourite hobby was just to get on the bike and pedal off out into the countryside. So being a loner was a great advantage in a way, in that working at home on my own was no problem. I can well imagine that a more gregarious person might have difficulty in working long hours at home, but I certainly didn't have that problem. But it did surface a wee bit when I was asked to attend conferences and meet people. I found that a wee bit difficult. Plus the exposure, I suppose, I took bad with. But fairly quickly I began to realise that I've been a very fortunate person in that I have had a very good life, earning a living, doing something that I really enjoy doing. So, as I say, the realisation came to me that maybe it was time that Kennedy put something back. So in that respect, that's why I enjoy these meetings, these conferences, because I get to meet the people who have, let's face it, paid my wages all these years, and they love to meet me, and I really, quite honestly, love to meet them. The commissions are a definite offshoot from the conferences, in that when folk met me and talked about my work, they obviously went back home and they had their favourite character, Dread or Dundee or whatever, and these little requests for small, usually they're just about an A4 size, little sketches of their favourite character. They would write in to me or email me, and we managed along quite nicely for a year or two, but it did begin to grow. Some of the commissions were a bit larger, and it got to the stage where about 2 years ago, 18 months, 2 years ago, it was beginning to be quite difficult to do the artwork, but also to cope with the tremendous number of emails, etc., that I was receiving. And I always feel that it's all, I feel my conscience will not allow me not to reply to a request. Even if I can't do it, I'd much rather at least respond to the commissioner and gives them the reason why. But most times, in fact, I can't quite honestly remember or think that I have ever actually refused a commission, because they know that they're keen to have it, but it has to be done in my time, because I don't want to be working. Nowadays, I'm getting on a wee bit, not keeping too well at times. So something like 3 to 4 hours at a drawing board is an absolute maximum. Commissions can sometimes take quite a few months to satisfy. But these wonderful fans out there, they're very patient. It's a nice relationship. But as I say, about 18 months, 2 years ago, it began to get the whole thing was just getting a wee bit too much. So on the recommendation of CAM, I contacted Mark Seton, who was doing a similar sort of job for CAM. In other words, managing commissions, etc., and sales. And Mark was more than happy to take it over. And Mark and I think his brother's name Peter, they set up a website, and it's all very nicely managed now, and he's quite invaluable, and it's all working quite nicely now.
So over the last number of years, you've been a regular at Thought Bubble.
Yes.
I wonder what your thoughts are about that particular comic convention.
Well, it's the comic convention as far as I'm concerned, except, well, I've got to say the one over in Enniskillen with my good friend Paul Trimble, that is an extra special one as well. But Thought Bubble was the one that I started going to quite regularly. And I was honoured 2 or 3 years ago, no, probably less time than that, as their first guest of honour. And to be quite honest, my feeling for Thought Bubble now is that it's almost a family occasion. I feel so at home, and meeting up with Martha Julian, who I think is the CEO, is always a pleasure, and it's a wonderfully organised show. They can't do enough for you, and I'm just so disappointed because of this virus business that we're going to be unable to attend this year. But fortunately, they're going to be doing something along the lines of virtual, is it? A virtual show? And I've been asked to take part in that, so it's better than nothing. But very sad not being able to make my annual trip to see the family.
There's always next year.
Yes, hopefully. You can just imagine the mood I was in when I wrote that out. Every stroke of the pen shows it.